5. Mr. X, or Captain Pogossian. SARKIS Pogossian, or as he is now called, Mr. X, is at the present time the owner of several ocean steamers, one of which, cruising among his favourite places between the Sunda and Solomon Islands, he commands himself. By race an Armenian, he was born in Turkey, but spent his childhood in Transcaucasia, in the town of Kars. I met Pogossian and become friends with him when he was still a young man, finishing his studies at the Theological Seminary of Echmiadzin and preparing for the priesthood. Before I met him, I had already heard about him through his parents, who lived in Kars, not far from our house, and often came to see my father. I knew that they had only one son, who had formerly studied at the Temegan Drops, or Theological Seminary of Echmiadzin, and was now at the Theological Seminary of Echmiadzin. Pogossian's parents were natives of Turkey, from the town of Erzurum, and had moved to Kars soon after it was taken by the Russians. His father was by profession a poagi. A poagi is a dyer. A person of this profession can always be recognised by his arms, which are blue to the elbows from the dye that can never be washed off. And his mother an embroideress in gold, specialising in breastplates and belts for juppais. A juppai is the special costume of the Armenian women of Erzurum. Living very simply themselves, they spent all they had to give their son a good education. SARKIS Pogossian rarely came to see his parents, and I never had an opportunity to see him in Kars. My first meeting with him took place the first time I was in Echmiadzin. Before going there, I returned to Kars for a short time to see my father and the parents of Pogossian. Learning that I would soon be leaving, for Echmiadzin asked me to take their son a small parcel of linen. I was going to Echmiadzin for the purpose, as always, of seeking an answer to the question of supernatural phenomena, in which my interest not only had not diminished, but had grown even stronger. I must say here, as I mentioned in the previous chapter, that having become extremely interested in supernatural phenomena, I had plunged into books and also applied to men of science for explanations of these phenomena. But failing to find answers that satisfied me, either in books or from the people I turned to, I began to seek them in religion. I visited various monasteries and went to see men about whose piety I had heard, read the Holy Scriptures and the lives of the saints, and was even for 3 months an acolyte of the famous Father Yevlampios in the monastery of Saniane. And I also made pilgrimages to most of the holy places of the many different faiths in Transcaucasia. During this period I happened again to witness a whole series of phenomena which was unquestionably real, but which I could in no way explain. This left me more bewildered than ever. For example, once when I went with a company of pilgrims from Alexandropol for a religious festival to a place on Mount Dajdur, known among the Armenians by the name of Amen-Pretz, I witnessed the following incident. A sick man, a paralytic, from the small village of Paldivan, was being taken there on a cart, and on the road we fell into conversation with the relatives who were accompanying the invalid and talked with them as we went along. This paralytic, who was barely 30 years old, had been ill for the past 6 years, but before that had been in perfect health and had even done military service. He had fallen ill after his return home from service, just before his wedding, and had lost all use of the left side of his body. In spite of various treatments by doctors and healers, nothing helped. He had even been specially taken for treatment to Mineral Vodi in the Caucasus, and now his relatives were bringing him here, to Armenia-Pretz, hoping against hope that the saint would help him and alleviate his sufferings. On the way to this holy place we made a special stop, as all pilgrims usually do, at the village of Discant to pray at the miraculous icon of our Saviour, which was in the house of a certain Armenian family. As the invalid also wished to pray, he was taken into the house, I myself helping to carry the poor man in. Soon afterwards we came to the foot of Mount Jadshur, on the slopes of which the little church with the miraculous tomb of the saint is situated. We halted at the place where the pilgrims usually leave their carts, wagons and vans at the end of the carriage road. From there the further ascent of 1/4 of a mile must be made on foot, and many walk barefoot, according to the custom there, while others even do this distance on their knees or in some other special way. When the paralytic was lifted from the cart to be carried to the top, he suddenly resisted, wishing to try to crawl up by himself as best he could. He was put on the ground and he started dragging himself along on his healthy side. He did this with such difficulty that it was pitiable to watch him, but he still refused all help. Resting often on the way, he finally, after 3 hours, reached the top, crawled to the tomb of the saint, which was in the centre of the church, and having kissed the tombstone, immediately lost consciousness. His relatives, with the help of the priests and myself, tried to revive him. We poured water into his mouth and bathed his head, and it was just as he came to himself that a miracle occurred. His paralysis was gone. At first the man was stupefied, but when he realised that he could move all his limbs, he sprang up and almost began to dance. Then, all of a sudden, recollecting himself, with a loud cry he flung himself prone and began to pray. All the people there, with their priest at their head, immediately fell on their knees and began to pray also. Then the priest stood up, and amidst the kneeling worshippers held a service of thanksgiving to the saint. Another incident, which puzzled me no less, took place in Kars. That year there was terrible heat and drought in the whole province of Kars. Almost all the crops had been scorched, a famine threatened, and the people were becoming agitated. That same summer there arrived in Russia from the Patriarchate of Antioch an archimandrite with a miraculous icon. I do not remember whether of St. Nicholas the miracle worker or of the Virgin, to collect money for the relief of the Greeks who suffered in the Cretan War. He travelled with this icon chiefly to places in Russia with a Greek population, and he also came to Kars. I do not know whether politics or religion was at the bottom of it all, but the Russian authorities in Kars, as elsewhere, took part in organising an impressive welcome and in according him all kinds of honours. When the archimandrite arrived in any town, the icon was carried from church to church, and the clergy, coming to meet it with banners, welcomed it with great solemnity. The day after the archimandrite arrived in Kars, the rumour spread that a special service for rain would be held before this icon by all the clergy at a place outside the town. And indeed, just after 12 o'clock on that same day, processions set out from all the churches with banners and icons to join in the ceremony at the appointed place. In this ceremony there took part the clergy of the old Greek church, of the recently rebuilt Greek cathedral, the military cathedral, the church of the Cuban regiment, and also of the Armenian church. It was a day of particularly intense heat. In the presence of almost the entire population, the clergy, with the archimandrite at their head, held a solemn service, after which the whole procession marched back towards the town. And then something occurred to which the explanations of contemporary people are absolutely inapplicable. Suddenly the sky became covered with clouds, and before the people had time to reach the town, there was such a downpour that everyone was drenched to the skin. In explanation of this phenomenon, as of others similar to it, one might of course use the stereotyped word coincidence, which is such a favourite word among our so-called thinking people, but it cannot be denied that this coincidence was almost too remarkable. The third incident occurred in Alexandropol, when my family had returned there for a short period and we were living again in our old house. Next door to us was my aunt's house. One of the lodgings in her house had been let to a Tatar who worked for the local district government either as a clerk or a secretary. He lived with his old mother and his little sister and had recently married a handsome girl, a Tatar from the neighbouring village of Karadog. Everything went well at first. 40 days after her marriage, the young wife, according to the Tartar custom, went to visit her parents. But there, either she caught cold or something else happened to her, for when she returned she did not feel well, had to go to bed, and gradually became very ill. They gave her the best of care, but in spite of being treated by several doctors, among whom I remember were the town doctor, Rezhnik, and the former army doctor, Gurdjieff, the condition of the sick woman went from bad to worse. An acquaintance of mine, a doctor's assistant, went every morning by order of Dr. Rezhnik to give her an injection. This doctor's assistant, whose name I do not remember, I only remember that he was unbelievably tall, often dropped in to see us when I was at home. One morning he came in while my mother and I were drinking tea. We invited him to join us at the table, and in the course of the conversation I asked him, among other things, how our neighbour was getting on. "She is very sick," he replied. "It is a case of galloping consumption, and doubtless it will soon be all over with her." While he was still sitting there, an old woman, the mother-in-law of the sick woman, came in and asked my mother's permission to gather some rose hips in our little garden. In tears she told us how Mariam Anna, as the Tartars called the Virgin, had appeared that night to the sick woman in a dream and bade her gather rose hips, boil them in milk and drink, and in order to calm her the old woman wished to do this. Hearing this, the doctor's assistant could not help laughing. My mother of course gave her permission and even went to help her. When I had seen the assistant off, I also went to help. What was my astonishment when, the next morning, on my way to the market, I met the invalid with the old woman coming out of the Armenian church of Sevzhan, where there is a miraculous icon of the Virgin, and a week later I saw her washing the windows of her house. Dr. Rezhnik, by the way, explained that her recovery, which seemed a miracle, was a matter of chance. These indubitable facts, which I'd seen with my own eyes, as well as many others I'd heard about during my searchings, all of them pointing to the presence of something supernatural, could not in any way be reconciled with what common sense told me, or with what was clearly proved by my already extensive knowledge of the exact sciences, which excluded the very idea of supernatural phenomena. This contradiction in my consciousness gave me no peace, and was all the more irreconcilable because the facts and proofs on both sides were equally convincing. I continued my searchings, however, in the hope that sometime, somewhere, I would at last find the real answer to the questions constantly tormenting me. And it was this aim which took me, among other places, to Echmiadzin, the centre of one of the great religions, where I hoped to find at least some slight clue leading to the solution of these inescapable questions. Echmiadzin, or as it is also called, Varga Shapat, is for the Armenians what Mecca is for the Muslims and Jerusalem for the Christians. Here is the residence of the Catholicos of all Armenians, and here is also the centre of Armenian culture. Every year, in the autumn, big religious festivals are held, to which come many pilgrims not only from parts of Armenia, but from all over the world. A week before the beginning of such a festival, all the surrounding roads are filled with pilgrims, some travelling on foot, others in carts and wagons, and still others on horses and asses. I travelled on foot, in company with other pilgrims from Alexandropol, having put my belongings in the wagon of the Molokan sect. On reaching Echmiadzin, I went directly, as was the custom, to worship at all the holy places. I then went into the town to look for a lodging, but it was impossible to find one, since all the inns, hotels did not exist then, were full and more than full, and so I decided to do as many others did, simply establish myself outside the town under a cart or wagon. But as it was still early, I decided first of all to do my errand, that is, find Pogossian and give him the parcel. He lived not far from the main inn in the house of a distant relative, the Archimandrite Surinan. I found him at home. He was about the same age as I, dark, of medium height, and had a small moustache. His eyes were very sad, but at times they burned with an inner fire. The right eye was slightly crossed. At that time he seemed to be very frail and shy. He began asking me about his parents, and having learned in the course of the conversation that I had not succeeded in finding lodgings, he ran off and, returning almost immediately, proposed that I should share his room. I of course accepted and went at once and brought back all my paraphernalia from the wagon, and I had just finished arranging a bed for myself with Pogossian's help when we were called to take supper with Father Sunianum, who greeted me affably and asked me about Pogossian's family and about things in general in Alexandropol. After supper I went with Pogossian to see the town and the sacred relics. It must be said that during the festival there is a great deal of movement all night in the streets of Echmiadzin, and all the cafes in Akshana are open. That whole evening and all the days following were spent with Pogossian. He took me everywhere, as he knew all the ins and outs of the town. We went to places where ordinary pilgrims do not have access, and even to the Khanzaran, where the treasures of Echmiadzin are kept, and where one is very rarely admitted. During our talks we discovered that the questions which were agitating me also interested him. Both of us had much material to share on these questions, and little by little our talks became more intimate and heart to heart, and a strong tie was gradually formed between us. Pogossian was nearing the end of his studies at the Theological Seminary, and in 2 years was to be ordained a priest, but his inner state did not correspond to this at all. Religious as he was nonetheless extremely critical of his environment and strongly averse to living among priests whose mode of life seemed to him to run entirely counter to his own ideals. When we had become friends, he told me a great deal about the hidden side of the life of the clergy there, and the thought that on becoming a priest he would have to live in this environment made him suffer inwardly and feel deeply distressed. After the holidays I stayed on in Echmiadzin for 3 more weeks, living with Pogossian in the house of the Archimandrite Surianen, and thus I had the opportunity more than once of talking about the subjects which agitated me with the Archimandrite himself, and also with other monks to whom he introduced me. But during my stay in Echmiadzin I did not find what I was looking for, and, having spent enough time to realise that I could not find it there, I went away with a feeling of deep inner disillusionment. Pogossian and I parted great friends. We promised to write to each other and to share our observations on the questions which interested us both. One fine day, 2 years later, Pogossian arrived in Tiflis and came to stay with me. He had graduated from the seminary and had been in Kars for a short time with his parents. Now he had only to marry in order to obtain a parish. His family had even found a bride for him, but he was in a state of complete indecision and did not know what to do. He would spend days on end reading all kinds of books that I had, and in the evenings, on my return home from work as a stoker at the Tiflis railway station, we would go together to the Mushtad and, walking along the deserted paths, we would talk and talk. Once, while walking in the Mushtad, I jokingly proposed that he should come to work with me at the railway station, and I was greatly astonished when the next day he insisted that I should help him get a place there. I did not try to dissuade him, but sent him with a note to my good friend the engineer Yaroslav, who at once gave him a letter of introduction to the station master, who took him on as an assistant locksmith. So it continued until October. We were still engrossed in abstract questions, and Pogossian had no thought of returning home. Once at the house of Yaroslav, I made the acquaintance of another engineer, Vasiliev, who had just arrived in the Caucasus to survey the route of the proposed railway between Tiflis and Kars. After we had met several times, he proposed one day that I should go with him on the survey as an overseer and interpreter. The salary offered was very tempting, almost 4 times as much as I was earning. I was already tired of my job, which was beginning to interfere with my main work, and as it also became clear that I should have much free time, I accepted. I proposed to Pogossian that he should go with me in some capacity or other, but he refused, as he had become interested in his work as a locksmith and wished to continue what he had begun. I travelled with this engineer for 3 months in the narrow valleys between Tiflis and Karaklis and managed to earn a great deal, having, besides my official salary, several unofficial sources of income of a rather questionable character. Knowing beforehand which villages and little towns the railway was to go past, I would send someone to the power possessors of these villages and towns, offering to arrange for the railway to be laid through these places. In most cases my offer was accepted, and I would receive for my trouble a private remuneration, and at times in the form of a rather large amount of money. When I returned to Tiflis, I had collected, including what remained from my previous earnings, quite a substantial sum, so I did not look for work again but devoted myself entirely to the study of the phenomena which interested me. Pogossian had meanwhile become a locksmith and also found time to read a great many books. He had recently become especially interested in ancient Armenian literature, of which he procured a large quantity from the booksellers as I. By this time Pogossian and I had come to the definite conclusion that there really was a certain something which people formerly knew, but now this knowledge was quite forgotten. We had lost all hope of finding any guiding clue to this knowledge in contemporary exact science, in contemporary books or from people in general, and so we directed all our attention to ancient literature. Having chanced to come across a whole collection of ancient Armenian books, Pogossian and I became interested in them and decided to go to Alexandropol to look for a quiet place where we could give ourselves up entirely to study. Arriving in Alexandropol, we chose as such a place the isolated ruins of the ancient Armenian capital, Ani, which is 30 miles from Alexandropol, and having built a hut among the ruins, we settled there, getting our food from the neighbouring villages and from shepherds. Ani became the capital of the Bagratid kings of Armenia in the year 962. It was taken by the Byzantine emperor in 1046, and at that time was already called the City of 1,000 Churches. Later it was conquered by the Seljuk Turks. Between 1125 and 1209 it was taken 5 times by the Georgians. In 1239 it was taken by the Mongols, and in 1313 it was completely destroyed by earthquake. Among the ruins there are, by the way, the remains of the Patriarch's Church, finished in the year 1010, the remains of 2 churches, also of the 11th century, and of a church which was completed about 1215. At this point in my writings I cannot pass by in silence a fact which, in my opinion, may be of interest to certain readers, namely that these historical data which I've just cited concerning the ancient Armenian capital Ani are the first, and I hope the last, that I have taken from information officially recognised on earth. That is to say, it is the first instance since the beginning of my writing activities in which I've had recourse to an encyclopedia. About the city Ani there still exists one very interesting legend, explaining why, after being called the City of 1,000 Churches for a long time, it came to be called the City of 1,001 Churches. This legend is as follows. Once the wife of a certain shepherd complained to her husband about the shocking misbehaviour in the churches. She said that there was no place for quiet prayer, and wherever one went the churches were as crowded and noisy as beehives. And the shepherd, heeding her just indignation, began building a church especially for his wife. In former times the word shepherd did not have the same meaning as it has now. Formerly a shepherd himself was the owner of the flocks he grazed, and shepherds were considered among the richest people of the country. Some of them even possessed several flocks and herds. When he had finished building the church, this shepherd called it the Church of the Shepherd's Pious Wife, and from then on the city of Ani was called the City of 1,001 Churches. Other historical data assert that, even before the shepherd built this church, there were many more than 1,000 churches in the city, but it is said that during the recent excavations a stone was found confirming the legend of the shepherd and his pious wife. Living among the ruins of this city and spending our days reading and studying, we sometimes for a rest made excavations in the hope of finding something, as there are many underground passages in the ruins of Ani. Once, Pogossian and I, while digging in one of these underground passages, noticed a place where the consistency of the ground had changed, and on digging further we discovered a new passage, which turned out to be a narrow one, blocked at the end with fallen stones. We cleared the stones away, and before us appeared a small room with arches crumbling with age. Everything indicated that it had been a monastic cell. There was nothing left in this cell but broken pottery and pieces of rotten wood, doubtless the remains of furniture, but in a kind of niche in the corner lay a pile of parchments. Some of the parchments were turning to dust, others were more or less preserved. With the utmost care we took them to our hut and tried to decipher them. They were written in a language which appeared to be Armenian but was unknown to us. I knew Armenian well, to say nothing of Pogossian. Nevertheless, we could not understand any of this writing, as it was a very ancient Armenian, very different from that of today. This discovery interested us so much that we left everything else and returned that same day to Alexandropol, where we spent many days and nights trying to decipher at least a few words. Finally, after a great deal of difficulty and much questioning of experts, it became clear that these parchments were simply letters written by one monk to another, a certain Father Aram. We were especially interested in one letter in which the writer referred to information he had received concerning certain mysteries. This parchment, however, was one of those which had been most damaged by time, and there were a number of words that we could only guess at, but we nevertheless succeeded in reconstructing the letter. What interested us most was not the beginning, but the end of this letter. It began with a long greeting, and went on about the ordinary small happenings in the life of a certain monastery where, as could be inferred, this Father Aram had formerly lived. Towards the end, one passage particularly attracted our attention. It said, "Our worthy Father Telvant has at last succeeded in learning the truth about the Sarmong Brotherhood. Their Ernest," and Ernest was a kind of corporation, "their Ernest actually did exist near the town of Siranush, and 50 years ago, soon after the migration of peoples, they also migrated and settled in the valley of Isuram, 3 days' journey from Niphasi." Then the letter went on about other matters. What struck us most was the word Sarmung, which we had come across several times in the book called Mekhavart. This word, in the name of a famous esoteric school which, according to tradition, was founded in Babylon as far back as 2500 BC, and which was known to have existed somewhere in Mesopotamia up to the 6th or 7th century AD, but about its further existence one could not obtain anywhere the least information. This school was said to have possessed great knowledge, containing the key to many secret mysteries. Many times had Pogossian and I talked of this school and dreamed of finding out something authentic about it, and now suddenly we find it mentioned in this parchment. We were greatly excited. But apart from its name being mentioned, we discovered nothing else from this letter. We knew no more than before when and how this school arose, where it had existed, or whether it might even still exist. After several days of laborious research, we were able to establish only the following. About the 6th or 7th century, the descendants of the Syrians, the Azores, were driven by the Byzantines out of Mesopotamia into Persia, and probably it was in this period that these letters were written. And when we were able to verify that the present city of Mosul, the former capital of the country of Nevi, had once been called Nifsi, the city mentioned in the parchment, and that at the present time the population round about this city consisted chiefly of Azores, we concluded that in all probability the letter referred precisely to these Azores. If such a school had really existed and had moved somewhere during that period, then it could only have been an Azorean school, and if it should still exist, then it must be among the Azores, and taking into consideration the indicated 3 days' journey from Mosul, it must now be situated somewhere between Urmia and Kurdistan, and it should not be too difficult to find out where it was. We therefore decided to go there and try at any cost to find out where the school was situated and then enter it. The Azores, who, as I've said, are descended from the Assyrians, are now scattered all over the earth. There are many of them in Transcaucasia, northwestern Persia and eastern Turkey, and one finds groups of them throughout the whole of Asia Minor. It is estimated that in all there are about 3 million of them. Most of them are Nestorians, that is, they do not acknowledge the divinity of Christ. The minority consists of Jacobites, Maronites, Catholics, Gregorians and others. Among them are also Yazidis or devil worshippers, though not in great number. Missionaries of various religions have recently manifested great zeal in converting the Azores to their different faiths, and one must give the Azores their due in that they have no less zealously converted themselves, outwardly changing their faith and even deriving from these conversions so much material benefit that this has become proverbial. In spite of all the differences of faith, almost the entire race is under the authority of the Patriarchate of the East Indies. The Azores live mostly in little villages ruled by priests. Several villages, or a certain district, constitute a clan which is ruled over by a prince, or as they call him, a melik. All the meliks are subordinate to the patriarch, whose office is hereditary, passing from uncle to nephew, and is said to derive originally from Simon, the brother of the Lord. It must be said that the Azores suffered very much in the last war, the First World War, having been a pawn in the hands of Russia and England, with the result that half of them perished from the vengeance of the Kurds and the Persians, and if the rest survived, it was only thanks to the American consul Dr. Y and his wife. The Azores, particularly those in America, and there are many of them there, ought, in my opinion, if Dr. Y is still living, to organise and permanently maintain at his door an Azorean guard of honour, and if he is dead, without fail to erect a monument to him at his birthplace. Just in that year when we decided to set out on our expedition, there was a great nationalist movement among the Armenians, and on everyone's lips were the names of the heroes who had fought for freedom, especially the name of young Andronik, who later became a national hero. Everywhere among the Turkish and Persian Armenians, as among the Russian Armenians, various parties and committees were being formed. Attempts at unity were made even while sordid quarrels kept breaking out among the different factions. In short, a violent political explosion was taking place, such as recurs from time to time in Armenia, with the usual train of consequences. Early one morning in Alexandropol, I was on my way, as usual, to the river Arpa Chai to bathe. Halfway, at the place called Karakuli, Pogossian overtook me, quite out of breath, and told me that the day before, in conversation with the priest, said he had learned that the Armenian committee wished to choose several volunteers from the members of the party to send to Mush on a special mission. When I got home, Pogossian continued, it suddenly occurred to me that we could make use of this opportunity for our purpose, that is, for trying to find traces of this Sarmon brotherhood. So I got up at sunrise and came to talk it over with you, but as I missed you, I ran to catch up with you. I interrupted him and said that in the first place we were not members of the party, and in the second place, he did not let me finish, but announced that he had already thought everything out and knew how it could be arranged, and all he now needed to know was whether I would agree to such a plan. I answered that I wished at any cost to get to the valley which was once named Izrumin, and that it was all the same to me how I got there, whether on the devil's back or even arm in arm with the priest Vlachov. Pogossian knew that this Vlachov was the man I most disliked, and whose presence exasperated me a mile away. If you say you can arrange it, I continued, then do whatever you please, and as circumstances demand, and I agree beforehand to everything, if only as a result we get to the place I have set as my goal. I do not know what Pogossian did, or with whom, or how he talked, but the result of his efforts was that several days later, provided with a considerable sum of Russian, Turkish and Persian money, and a great many letters of introduction to people living in the different places along our proposed route, we set out from Alexandropol in the direction of Echmiadzin. In 2 weeks we arrived at the banks of the river Arax, which is the natural frontier between Russia and Turkey, and crossed it with the aid of some Kurds, who had been sent to meet us. It seemed to us that we had now surmounted the greatest difficulties, and we hoped that from there on everything would go smoothly and successfully. We travelled mostly on foot, staying either with shepherds or with people recommended to us in the villages already passed through, or with those persons to whom we had letters from Alexandropol. It must be confessed that although we had undertaken certain obligations and attempted, as far as possible, to carry them out, we never lost sight of our real purpose for the journey, the itinerary of which did not always coincide with the places of our commissions. On such occasions we did not hesitate to leave them unfulfilled, and, truth to tell, did not experience on this account any great remorse of conscience. When we had passed the Russian frontier, we decided to go over Mount Egri Dag, even though it was the most difficult way, because it gave us a better chance of avoiding the numerous bands of Kurds and the Turkish detachments who were pursuing the Armenians. Having crossed over the pass, we turned south towards Van, leaving on our right the region of the sources of the great rivers Tigris and Euphrates. During our journey we had thousands of adventures which I will not describe, but there is one that I cannot pass by in silence. Although it happened so many years ago, I still cannot recall this incident without laughing and without, at the same time, re-experiencing the sensation I had then, of instinctive fear combined with a presentiment of imminent catastrophe. Many times after this incident I found myself in very critical situations. For example, more than once I was surrounded by scores of dangerous enemies. I have had to cross the path of a Turkestan tiger, and several times I was taken literally at the point of a gun. But never did I have such a feeling as I experienced on this occasion, however comical it may seem now, after the event. Pogossian and I were calmly walking along. He was humming some march and swinging his stick. Suddenly, as if from nowhere, a dog appeared, then another, and still another. In all about 15 sheepdogs who began barking at us. Pogossian impudently threw a stone at them, and they immediately sprang at us. They were Kurd sheepdogs, very vicious, and in another moment they would have torn us to pieces if I had not instinctively pulled Pogossian down and made him sit beside me on the road. Just because we sat down, the dogs stopped barking and springing at us. Surrounding us, they also sat down. Some time passed before we came to ourselves, and when we were able to take stock of the situation, we burst out laughing. As long as we remained sitting, the dogs also sat, peaceably and still, and when we threw them bread from our knapsacks, they ate it with great pleasure, some of them even wagging their tails in gratitude. But when, reassured by their friendliness, we tried to stand up, then, oh no you don't, for they instantly jumped up and, baring their teeth, made ready to spring at us. So we were compelled to sit down once more. When we again tried to get up, the dogs showed themselves so viciously hostile that we did not risk trying a third time. In this situation we remained sitting for about 3 hours. I do not know how much longer we would have had to sit there if a young Kurd girl had not chanced to appear in the distance with an ass, gathering kisiak in the fields. Making various signs to her, we finally managed to attract her attention, and when she came closer and saw what the trouble was, she went off to fetch the shepherds to whom the dogs belonged, who were not far away behind a hill. The shepherds came and called off the dogs, but only when they were at some distance did we risk standing up, and all the time they were moving away, the rascals kept an eye on us. As it turned out, we had been most naive in assuming that after crossing the river Arax, we'd have left the greatest difficulties and troubles behind us. As a matter of fact, it was only there that they began. The greatest difficulty was that after crossing this frontier river and going over Mount Egri Dag, we could no longer pass for Azores, as we had until the encounter with the dogs, because we now found ourselves in places populated by general Azores. To travel as Armenians in regions where at that time they were being persecuted by all the other races was quite out of the question. It was also dangerous to go as Turks or Persians. It would have been preferable to pass ourselves off as Russians or Jews, but neither Pogossian's appearance nor mine would permit this. At that time, great care had to be taken if one wished to conceal one's real nationality, because to be found out in any disguise would have been very dangerous. The natives were not then over-particular in their choice of means for getting rid of undesirable foreigners. For instance, it was rumoured from authentic sources that several Englishmen had recently been flayed alive by Azores for having attempted to make copies of certain inscriptions. After long deliberation, we decided to disguise ourselves as Corsican Tartars. Somehow or other we made the appropriate changes in our dress and continued on our journey. Exactly 2 months after crossing the river Arax, we finally came to the town of Zed, beyond which we had to go through a certain pass in the direction of Syria. In this pass, before reaching the famous waterfall of Kay, we were to turn off towards Kurdistan, and it was somewhere along this road that we expected to find the place which was the chief objective of our journey. In our further peregrinations, since we had by this time sufficiently adapted ourselves to surrounding conditions, everything went along fairly smoothly until one unexpected accident changed all our intentions and plans. One day we were sitting by the roadside eating our bread and the tarak we had brought with us. Tarak is a strongly salted fish, quite popular in those regions and caught only in Lake Van. Suddenly Pogossian jumped up with a shout, and I saw darting away from under him a big yellow phalanger. I at once understood the cause of his cry and springing up killed the phalanger and rushed to Pogossian. He had been bitten in the leg. I knew that the bite of this insect, a kind of tarantula, is often fatal, and so I instantly tore away the clothes to suck the wound. But seeing he had been bitten in the fleshy part of the leg, and knowing that sucking the wound would be dangerous if there were the slightest scratch in one's mouth, I took the lesser risk for both of us, seized my knife, and quickly cut away a piece of my comrade's calf. But in my haste, I cut away too much. Obviating in this way all danger of fatal poisoning, I felt less anxious and immediately began washing the wound and bandaging it as best as I could. As the wound was large and Pogossian had lost much blood and all kinds of complications were to be feared, it was not possible for the time being to think of continuing the journey we had mapped out. We had to decide at once what was to be done. Having talked it over together, we decided to spend the night there on the spot, and in the morning to find some means of reaching the town of N, 30 miles away, where we had a letter to deliver to a certain Armenian priest, a commission we had not carried out as this town was not on the route we had planned before the accident. The next day, with the help of an old Kurd, who happened to be passing and who turned out to be quite friendly, I hired in a little village nearby a kind of cart harnessed to 2 oxen, which was used for carting manure, and putting Pogossian in it set out in the direction of N. It took us almost 48 hours to cover this short distance, stopping every 4 hours to feed the oxen. We finally arrived at N and went straight to the Armenian priest, to whom we had a letter of introduction as well as the letter to be delivered. He received us most amiably, and when he learned what had happened to Pogossian, he immediately offered him a room in his house, which of course we most gratefully accepted. While still on the road, Pogossian's temperature had risen, and although it went down on the 3rd day, the wound had festered and had to be treated with great care. That is how we came to accept the hospitality of this priest for almost a whole month. Living so long under the same roof with this priest and frequently talking with him about anything and everything, very close relations were gradually established between us. Once, in the course of conversation, he told me, by the way, about a certain object he possessed and the story connected with it. It was an ancient parchment with some kind of map on it. It had been in his family a long time and had been passed down to him by inheritance from his great-grandfather. The year before last, said the priest, a man who was quite unknown to me came and asked me to show him the map. How he could have known that I had it, I have no idea. It all seemed to me suspicious, and not knowing who he was, I did not at first wish to show it to him, and even denied that I had it. But when he persisted in asking me about it, I thought, why should I not let him see it? And I did show it to him. He had hardly looked at the parchment when he asked me whether I would sell it to him, and immediately offered me 200 Turkish pounds for it. Although the sum was large, I did not wish to sell it, not being in need of the money and not wishing to part with something I was accustomed to having and which I cherished as a remembrance. This stranger, it appeared, was staying with our bey. The next day the bey's servant came to me, on behalf of their newly arrived guest, with an offer to buy the parchment for £500. I must say that from the moment the stranger had left my house, many things had seemed to me suspicious. First of all, this man had apparently come a long way specifically for this parchment. Then the incomprehensible means by which he had learned that it was in my possession. And finally, the intense interest he showed while looking at it. All this taken together proved to me that this thing must be very valuable. So when he offered such a sum as £500, although inwardly tempted by the offer, I feared to let the things go too cheaply and, deciding to be cautious, again refused. In the evening the stranger came to see me again, this time accompanied by the bey himself. When he renewed his offer to pay me £500 for the parchment, I flatly refused to sell it at all. But as he had come with our bey, I invited them both in as my guests. They came in, and we drank coffee and talked about one thing and another. In the course of conversation, it transpired that my visitor was a Russian prince. He told me, among other things, that he was interested in antiques, and as this parchment fitted so well into his collection, he, being a connoisseur, wished to buy it and had offered a sum far above the value of the article. But he considered it would be foolish to pay more and regretted that I refused to sell it. The bey, who had been listening attentively to our conversation, became interested in the parchment and expressed a wish to see it. When I bought the parchment, and they were both looking at it, the bey was obviously astonished that such a thing was worth so much. During the conversation, the prince suddenly asked me how much I would take to let him make a copy of my parchment. I hesitated, not knowing what to answer, as, speaking frankly, I was afraid that I had lost a good customer. He then offered me £200 to let him make a copy, and this time I felt ashamed to bargain as, in my opinion, he was giving me this sum for nothing. Just think, for permission merely to make a copy of the parchment I was receiving as much as £200. Without thinking longer about it, I agreed to the prince's offer, telling myself that, after all, the parchment would remain with me, and I would always be able to sell it if I wished. The next morning the prince returned. We spread the parchment out on the table, and the prince added water to some powdered alabaster he had brought with him. After covering the parchment with oil, he spread the alabaster over it. Several minutes later he removed the alabaster, wrapped it up in a piece of old djinn I gave him, paid me £200 and went away. Thus did God send me £200 for nothing, and I have the parchment to this day. The priest's story interested me greatly, but I have no sign of it, and simply asked him, as though out of curiosity, to show me what it was for which he had been offered such a large sum of money. The priest went to a chest and took out a roll of parchment. When he unrolled it, I could not at first make out what it was, but when I looked at it more closely, my God, what I experienced at that moment, I shall never forget it. I was seized with violent trembling, which was all the more violent because I was inwardly trying to restrain myself and not show my excitement. What I saw, was it not precisely what I had spent long months of sleepless nights thinking about? It was a map of what is called pre-sand Egypt. With great effort I continued trying to look as though I was not particularly interested in this thing and spoke of something else. The priest rolled up the parchment and put it back in the chest. I was no Russian prince to pay £200 for making a copy, yet this map was perhaps no less necessary to me than to him. I therefore decided then and there that at any cost I must have a copy, and at once began to think how it could be obtained. By this time, Pogossian was feeling so much better that we used to take him out on the terrace, where he would sit for long hours in the sun. I arranged that he would let me know when the priest went out on his business, and the next day, on hearing from him that the priest had left the house, I went stealthily into his room to fit a key to his heirloom chest. The first time I was not able to note all the details of the key, and it was not until the third attempt, after numerous filings, that I succeeded in making one fit. One evening, 2 days before our departure, while the priest was absent, I got into his room again and took the parchment from the chest. I took it to our room, and throughout the night Pogossian and I traced all the details of the map, having covered it with oiled paper. The next day I put the parchment back in its place. From the moment I had this treasure, so full of mystery and promise, securely and unnoticeably sewn in the lining of my clothes, it was as if all my other interests and intentions evaporated. An eagerness which was not to be restrained arose in me to reach at any cost and without delay the places where, with the aid of this treasure, I could at last appease that desire for knowledge which during the past 2 or 3 years had given me no rest, gnawing me within like a worm. After this perhaps justifiable, but nevertheless, whatever way one regards it, culpable treatment of the hospitality of the Armenian priest, I talked things over with my still half-sick comrade Pogossian. I persuaded him not to spare his lean financial resources, but to buy 2 good local saddle horses, of the kind we had noticed during our stay there, and whose peculiar, quick, ambling trot we admired, so that we could set off as soon as possible in the direction of Syria. The gait of the horses bred in that locality is indeed so smooth that one can ride on them almost at the speed of the flight of a large bird, holding in one's hand a glass full of water without spilling a single drop. I will not describe here all the ups and downs of our journey, nor the unforeseen circumstances which forced us frequently to change our route. I will only say that exactly 4 months after we took leave of that hospitable and kindly Armenian priest, we reached the town of Simra, where, on the evening of our arrival, we had an adventure which happened to be a turning point in the subsequent destiny of Pogossian. That evening we went to a small Greek restaurant for a little diversion after the period of difficulty and strain we had just been through. We were leisurely drinking the famous dorziko and helping ourselves to this and that, as is the local custom, from the numerous small saucers piled with all kinds of hors d'oeuvres, from dried mackerel to salted chickpeas. Besides ourselves, there were several groups of people in the restaurant, most of them sailors from the foreign ships anchored in the harbour. They were rather rowdy, and it was evident that they had already visited more than one tavern and had got themselves, as is said, pretty well soaked. Between the sailors of different nations, sitting at separate tables, squabbles arose from time to time, which were at first confined to an interchange of noisy epithets in a peculiar jargon, mostly a mixture of Greek, Italian and Turkish. And then, suddenly, without warning, an explosion occurred. I do not know how the gunpowder was ignited, but all at once a rather large group of sailors sprang up in a body and with threatening gestures and shouts threw themselves upon some other sailors sitting not far from us. The latter also sprang up, and in the twinkling of an eye a free fight was in full swing. Pogossian and I, also somewhat excited by the fumes of the doriziko, rushed to help the smaller group of sailors. We had no idea what it was all about, or even who was getting the best and who the worst of it. When the other people in the restaurant and the military patrol, which happened to be passing, had separated us, scarcely a single one of those in the fight had come out unscathed. One had a broken nose, another was spitting blood, and so on, while I stood in the middle of them, decorated with enormous black left eye, and Pogossian, cursing all the time in Armenian, groaned and gasped, complaining of an unbearable pain under the 5th rib. When, as the sailors would have said, the storm abated, Pogossian and I, finding that we had had enough for one evening, had been sufficiently diverted by these good people, and not even by request, dragged ourselves home to sleep. It cannot be said that we were very talkative on the way home. My eye kept shutting involuntarily, and Pogossian was groaning and cursing himself for not minding his own business. The next morning at breakfast, reviewing our physical condition and our rather idiotic behaviour of the previous evening, we decided not to postpone the trip to Egypt we had planned, as we calculated that the long voyage on the boat and the pure sea air would cure our wounds of battle completely by the time we arrived there. So we went at once to the port to find out if there was a ship to suit our pockets, which would soon be going to Alexandria. We discovered that there was a Greek sailing vessel in the harbour about to leave for Alexandria, and we hurried off to the office of the steamship company to which this ship belonged to get the necessary information. Just at the door of this office, a sailor ran up to us and, jabbering something or other in broken Turkish, began warmly and excitedly shaking hands with both of us. At first we did not understand anything, but it soon became clear that he was an English sailor, one of the group in whose defence we had fought the previous evening. Gesturing to us to wait, he hurried off and a few minutes later returned accompanied by 3 comrades, one of whom, as we afterwards learned, was an officer. All of them thanked us warmly for what we had done the day before and then insisted that we go to a Greek restaurant nearby to have a glass of Gurdjieff with them. After 3 rounds of the miraculous Gurdjieff, that worthy offspring of the beneficent mastiki of the ancient Greeks, we began to talk more and more noisily and freely, of course thanks to the ability we had all inherited of making ourselves understood by ancient Greek mimicry and ancient Rome gesticulation, as well as with the help of words taken from all the seaport languages on earth. When they learned that we wished to get somehow or other to Alexandria, then the beneficent effect of that worthy offspring of the invention of the ancient Greeks did not fail to make itself manifest in a most striking manner. The sailors, as though they had forgotten our existence, began talking among themselves, and whether they were quarrelling or joking we could not tell. Suddenly, 2 of them, finishing their drinks in one gulp, went off in a great hurry, while the 2 who were left vied with each other, in a tone of benevolent concern, to assure and reassure us of something or other. At last we began to guess what it was all about, and, as it afterwards turned out, our guess was almost correct. Those 2 comrades of theirs who had suddenly left had gone to put in a word for us in the proper quarter, so that we may go on their ship, which was sailing the next day for Piraeus, from there to Sicily, and from Sicily to Alexandria, where it would stop for about 2 weeks before sailing to Bombay. The sailors took a long time to come back, and while waiting for them we did justice to the magnificent offspring of Mystica, to the accompaniment of strong words from all languages. In spite of this pleasant way of passing the time, waiting for favourable news, Pogossian, evidently remembering his 5th rib, suddenly lost patience and started to insist that we should not wait any longer, but should return home at once. Moreover, he assured me with great earnestness that my other eye was also beginning to look black. Considering that Pogossian had not entirely recovered from the phalanger bite, I could not refuse, and, without going into any explanations with our chance companions in the consumption of Gurdjieff, I obediently got up and went off after him. Astonished by the unexpected and silent departure of their defenders of the day before, the sailors got up too and came along after us. We had rather a long way to go. Each of us entertained himself in his own way. One sang, another gesticulated, as if to prove something to somebody. Another was whistling some military march. As soon as we arrived, Pogossian lay down at once, without even undressing, and I, giving up my bed to the elder sailor, simply stretched out on the floor, making a sign to the other to do the same. Waking up in the night with a terrible headache and recalling in snatches everything that had happened the day before, I remembered, among other things, the sailors who had come home with us, but when I looked round the room I discovered that they had gone. I went back to sleep, and it was already late when I was awakened by the clatter of dishes made by Pogossian preparing tea, and by his singing, as he did every morning, the special Armenian morning prayer. Lutzadzov, Lusen, Parin, yes, Avadam, Saya, Gentatanin. Neither Pogossian nor I wanted tea that morning. We wanted something very sour. We drank only some cold water and without exchanging a single word went back to bed. We were both very depressed and felt wretched in every way. In addition, I had a sensation in my mouth as though at least a dozen Cossacks with their horses and harness had spent the night there. While we were still lying in this condition, each of us thinking his own thoughts in silence, the door was suddenly pushed open and 3 English sailors burst into the room. Only one of them had been with us the day before. The other 2 we saw for the first time. Interrupting each other constantly, they tried to tell us something. By asking questions and racking our brains, we finally understood that they wanted us to get up, dress quickly, and go with them to their ship, as they had received permission from the authorities to take us with them as extra ship hands. While we were dressing, the sailors continued talking among themselves gaily. I was clear from their faces. Then suddenly, much to our astonishment, all of them jumped up together and began packing our belongings. By the time we had finished dressing, called the Eustabash of the caravanessa and paid our bill, our things were already neatly packed, and the sailors, dividing them among themselves, made signs to us to follow them. We all went out into the street and walked towards the harbour. When we got there, we saw a small boat at the wharf with 2 sailors in it who were evidently waiting for us. We stepped into the boat, and after being rowed along for half an hour, with the English sailors singing all the time, we came alongside a fairly large warship. It was obvious that we were expected on board, for no sooner did we reach the deck than some sailors standing at the gangway quickly took our things and led us to a small cabin which had been assigned to us and made ready beforehand in the hold near the galley. When we had somehow settled ourselves in this stuffy but, as it seemed to us, very cosy corner of the warship, we went out on the upper deck, accompanied by one of the sailors for whom we had fought in the restaurant. We sat down on some coils of rope, and soon we were surrounded by almost all the crew, both ordinary sailors and junior officers. All of them, irrespective of their rank, seemed to have a marked feeling of friendliness towards us. Every one of them felt obliged to shake hands with us and, taking our ignorance of English into account, tried with the aid of gestures and what words they knew in various languages to say something obviously pleasant. During this very original conversation in many languages, one of the sailors, who spoke tolerable Greek, suggested that during the voyage each one present should set himself the task of learning every day at least 20 words. We in English, they in Turkish. This proposal was approved by all with noisy applause, and 2 sailors from among our friends of the day before at once began choosing and writing down those English words which they thought we ought to learn first, and Pogossian and I made a list of Turkish words for them. When the launch with the senior officers came alongside and the hour of sailing drew near, all the crew went off to carry out their duties, and Pogossian and I at once set to work to memorise the first 20 English words, which were written phonetically in Greek characters. We were so absorbed in learning these 20 words and in trying to pronounce correctly the unaccustomed sounds so foreign to our ear, that we did not notice that evening had come and the ship was under way. We broke off our occupation only when a sailor came towards us, swaying to the measured rolling of the ship, and explaining with a very expressive gesture that it was time to eat, took us to our cabin near the galley. During the meal we discussed matters between ourselves, and after consulting the sailor who spoke tolerable Greek, we decided to ask permission, which was granted that very evening, for me to begin the next morning cleaning the metalwork on the ship, and for Pogossian to work in some capacity or other in the engine room. I will not dwell on the events during the remainder of our voyage on that warship. On arriving at Alexandria, I warmly took leave of the hospitable sailors and left the ship with the burning determination to reach Cairo as soon as possible. But Pogossian, who had become friends with several of the sailors during the voyage and was enthusiastic about his work in the engine room, wished to stay on the ship and go further. We agreed to keep in touch with each other. As I later learned, Pogossian, after we had parted, continued to work in the engine room of this English warship, acquired a passion for mechanics, and became very close friends with several of the sailors and younger officers. From Alexandria he went with this ship to Bombay, and then, after calling at various Australian ports, finally landed in England. There, in the city of Liverpool, persuaded by these new English friends of his and through their influence, he entered a technical institute of marine engineering where, along with intensive technical studies, he perfected himself in the English language. At the end of 2 years, he became a qualified mechanical engineer. In concluding this chapter devoted to the first comrade and friend of my youth, Pogossian, I wish to mention a certain highly original feature of his general psyche which was apparent from his earliest years and was very characteristic of his individuality. Pogossian was always occupied. He was always working at something. He never sat, as he said, with folded arms, and one never saw him lying down, like his comrades, reading diverting books which gave nothing real. If he had no definite work to do, he would either swing his arms in rhythm, mark time with his feet, or make all kinds of manipulations with his fingers. I once asked him why he was such a fool as not to rest, since no one would pay him anything for these useless exercises. Yes, indeed, he replied, for the present no one will pay me for these foolish antics of mine, as you and all those pickled in the same barrel of brine think they are. But in the future, either you, yourself, or your children will pay me for them. Joking apart, I do this because I like work, but I like it not with my nature, which is just as lazy as that of other people and never wishes to do anything useful. I like work with my common sense. Please bear in mind, he added, that when I use the word I, you must understand it not as the whole of me, but only as my mind. I love work and have set myself the task of being able, through persistence, to accustom my whole nature to love it, and not my reason alone. Further, I am really convinced that in the world no conscious work is ever wasted. Sooner or later someone must pay for it. Consequently, if I now work in this way, I achieve 2 of my aims. First, I shall perhaps teach my nature not to be lazy, and secondly, I will provide for my old age. As you know, I cannot expect that when my parents die they will leave me an ample inheritance to suffice for the time when I will no longer have the strength to earn a living. I also work because the only real satisfaction in life is to work, not from compulsion, but consciously. That is what distinguishes man from a Karabakh ass, which also works day and night. This reasoning of his has been fully justified by facts. Although he spent his whole youth, the time most valuable to a man for securing his old age, in, as it were, useless wanderings, and never concerning himself with making money for his later life. And although he did not go into a serious business until the year 1908, he is now one of the richest men on earth. As for his honesty in earning his wealth, that cannot be questioned. He was right when he said that no conscious labour is ever wasted. He did indeed work consciously and conscientiously, day and night, like an ox, all his life, in all circumstances and under all conditions. May God grant him now, at last, his well-earned rest.